Hi, I'm Betty Prime with Meadors Conservation and Preservation Planning. Thanks so much for your interest in historic colors of South Carolina. Today we're going to walk through a little bit about the paint sampling process. Okay, so the Historic Colors of South Carolina is all about creating a database of historic palettes. So the hope is once we look at enough buildings within each community, we'll gain a better understanding of what colors are common and unusual in your communities and also across South Carolina. So the first step really in doing a paint study, whether you're doing it yourself or someone here at Meadors is doing it for you, is to understand where to sample on a building. So one of the things I always start with is how has my building changed over time? So if you're interested in historic paint colors, you don't want to sample something that is relatively modern, or if you don't really understand how the building has evolved over time. A recent project we worked on here in downtown Charleston, this is a brownstone structure. And when we started, we were interested in looking at several of the wooden elements and understanding the color palette of those originally. First, we pulled up some historic photographs and did some research and found in these illustrations and photographs from as early as 1883, and this illustration is from 1875, that the door configuration seen here looks to be the same as it was in these very early photographs. In addition, you see the mutton configuration of the windows is also very similar to how it is today. The cornice too, you're seeing a lot of parallels. So we know that there seems to be evidence that these things may be original to the building. We won't really know until we begin sampling, but it gives you a good indication of where to start. This really can sometimes be the tricky part, which is actually extracting the samples. So our analysis is really based on these samples that you're taking from the building, so it's important that you get it right. So walking you through a little bit about the steps, one of the things I always try to think about when taking a sample is, especially if you're on a surface that gets abraded often with people moving in and out of the structure, like a door. I wouldn't sample an area near the base of the building or near the doorknob, because those are sections where the hands and feet are constantly touching the door and you can abrade off these surfaces over time. So looking at this sample here, you'll notice that in historic paints and old buildings, a lot of times there's excess paint buildup and they can be quite brittle. So you have to be quite careful when you're sampling it. And really the goal is that you want to capture all of the paint layers as well as the substrate below. Meaning the substrate is, whether it's a metal railing, you want to get a little sliver of the metal. Whether it's a wooden element, you want to get a little piece of the wood. If it's stucco, you want to get a little section of the stucco. So we're going to walk over here and look at a cornice sample from a previous project. You can use a couple of different tools when sampling. This is an X-Acto blade. You can find this at a local craft store such as Michael's, or actually also Lowe's. Another type of tool that we typically use is a scalpel. This might be something that is a little more advanced. It's very sharp. I find it a lot easier to use, and you can order something like this off of Amazon. So normally what I do is I start with making an indentation in the paint to cut through the layers. And as you can see, this is quite hard. And so you're having to really cleave the paint layers down to the substrate. And because it's so old, oftentimes it can be brittle as well. So then sometimes I'll cut it across the top and try to create that division. And see, this piece just popped off. And you can see that there's imprints of the wood. That's a pretty good sample. In an ideal world, you'd also want to get a piece of the substrate. And so if you cut deeper and then push through and pull out, then you can typically get a section of the substrate below. These type of samples are about the size that you would normally extract. You need a minimum of 2 samples in order to perform historic paint analysis. One you'll cast and look at under the microscope, and the second one you'll use for color matching. So the third step, I find this to be actually one of the most important steps and something that's often overlooked during the paint analysis process, especially if you're trying to do this yourself. If you're sending samples to the lab, it's important that we understand where they come from on the building so that our analysis can be accurate and our understanding of the color palette will also be accurate. So a few ways that you can do this that I found in the past are quite simple. is normally I start with a photograph. So if you take a photograph of your building and then you can just print it either on a piece of paper or you can print an actual photograph. But then I'll take a pen and mark the locations where I extract the samples so that they can be labeled later as part of the report. Some of you guys who might have done a previous restoration or renovation project might actually even have floor plans, or if you're quite talented, you might be able to draw these yourself. But these can also be a useful tool for locating the samples as you're extracting them. But if you don't have either of these things available, you just have to be a really good note taker. So this is an example of a coin envelope, which is what I use typically to store my samples after extracting. And I like to record the location of the sample site, which would be in this case the Smith house, the location where I took the sample, which would be exterior siding, the date the sample was extracted, and then the number of the sample. And if you're handy with a pen and you are decent at sketching, then you can kind of do a diagram of exactly where you took the sample. And this helps us here in the lab understand where it came from exactly, especially if you don't have photographs as evidence of the locations. Step 4. Send your samples to the Metters Laboratory. With your samples, if you have it, include information such as historic photographs, National Register nominations, and any type of illustrations you might have of your property. This really helps us when we move on to the analysis side of our paint study. Your samples will typically be about this size, so you think about a small end of your fingernail. And what we do is we take these and we cast them with resin into a small ice cube tray. Once they've cured, then we move on to the next step. So step 5, once you've got your samples cast and they've dried and they're in the cube form, you'll see here that we have a label system. This helps us to keep up with these individual samples and what they are. So we're currently working on a project in Bluffton, South Carolina for the Squire Pope Carriage House. So our labeling system is SP, meaning Squire Pope, E, exterior of the building, and then 11 is the sample number. And these sample numbers correlate to a master list that we create once sampling is complete. And so this tells us the sample number, where it came from, the actual item, and then as we move through the analysis phase, we record our findings here. So once the cubes are complete and we've cut them with a bone saw, then we end up with this small sliver that then gets polished. This is all we need in order to do our analysis. So once this is complete, we move on to the next step. So once you've got your small, tiny sample polished, you're ready to view under the microscope. In our lab, we use both visual and UV light to analyze the samples. Once you've magnified the sample under the microscope, you get photomicrographs that look similar to this. To some people, this just might look like a layering system, kind of like a bunch of colors smushed together. But as paint analysts, you can really visualize what the original color schemes were. This is the substrate, which is the wood in this case for the sample, which came from a shutter. And then you see a green layer here, and then a kind of transparent honey color here. This is the first paint scheme, and this was actually a green paint with a varnish layer on top. Over time, you'll see that the paint colors of the shutter have changed. You had a more cream color here, green, and then at some point it was actually red. Some of you may wonder how this type of analysis differs from, say, just taking a paint chip off of your home and taking it to a local hardware store and asking them to color match it. Some of the things that we don't really think about today is that many historic paints have pigments that aren't stable. So oftentimes you might be looking at a color that it is today, but over time it's changed. A good example of that is lead-based oil paints. The linseed oil that was used to make up that paint yellows over time. So even though a paint color today might look more cream, historically it was much more light in color. So through our analysis, we're able to identify the types of pigments and the oils that were used for that paint, and then really understand what that changes over time, and then give you a better understanding of what the true color was. The goal of the Historic Colors of South Carolina is to create a one-of-a-kind database of historic color palettes and gain a better understanding of what colors are common and unusual in your communities and across South Carolina. Some of the important reasons why we analyze historic structures is to understand what the original colors over the building and how the architecture was articulated because of those paint schemes. The composition of the coatings can also be important, especially if you're trying to understand potentially why you might be having failures on your structure. Understanding of the evolution of the building can also be found out through paint analysis. Through the analysis of painted surfaces on buildings from various time periods and locations in South Carolina, we can determine which materials were preferred and readily available during specific years. The color palette research for the historic colors of South Carolina will add significantly to our understanding of the aesthetic, cultural, and economic influences of the people who settled and built South Carolina. To download the full brochure and to learn how to bring this study to your community, visit www.meadorsinc.com/SC Paint Study.